well, if I want to kind of turn it to Carlos, there is, an inclusion. There's still a huge wage gap between men and women, and this is not a problem just with APEC economies, it's a universal problem. Carlos, can you make the case for both men and women to have the same level of economic empowerment from your findings?
Yeah, well, it's really clear, the statistics, it says that women more or less get 70% what men get, and that's very worrying. So APEC has long been advocating for women's economic empowerment for more than a decade. It actually started in the US the last time US organized APEC, and it was in this city, in San Francisco, where all of this discussion started. And so what we are currently doing in APEC is to implement a roadmap for women and inclusive growth with the intention of having a non-discriminatory laws, policies, regulations that provide equal opportunities to women in comparison to men in the labor market. Also, we are looking at having in place rules that prohibit discrimination based on sex to access to credit and capital. We are also trying to increase the gender balance in leadership positions. We notice that women, unfortunately, are underrepresented as managers, directors, also in terms of owning businesses. They are underrepresented. And also, we would like to have more representation of women studying on STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and of course, working in those fields.
Yeah, it's underrepresentation. That's why we have Crystal, who is representative of that space as a woman advocate for STEM studies and also a business owner. From your perspective, let's talk about skills building and how can APEC economies help balance the underrepresentation?
So as Pam introduced, I've tried to advocate for STEM back home in Papua New Guinea because tech is an industry that's known to be very male-dominated. So one of the key important things for a lot of girls and young women coming up is to have representation and to have role models in the industry. Because studies have shown that when you ask primary school kids about what they think of a coder, they imagine a guy in a hoodie sitting on a computer coding. They don't associate that to a female doing that. So I think representation, visual representation is very important, and knowing that a lady has done this, has done that, can go a long way in motivating girls. So just to give an example with some of my personal experiences, I lectured at the University of Papua New Guinea. I took the fourth year computer science students on one of the special topics, and there was only one girl in the class in that particular course I was taking, but I learned that in the beginning of the year, there were actually 7 girls, but seven females, sorry, to be specific. But 6 of them left because they found that there wasn't enough support, and they didn't have enough role models in school, at university. But also they didn't. They perceived STEM to be sort of a difficult subject to pursue, so they went and they took humanities or some other social science-based course. But I will just say, just to quickly sum up, that women in STEM are very critical, and as Carlos pointed out, for sustainable economic growth and in the region, because we know that women bring diverse perspectives to the table, and talents and innovations to address complex challenges and opportunities in the region. However, there is a lot of underrepresentation in STEM fields due to various factors such as social and cultural norms, stereotypes, biases, and discrimination that discourage them from pursuing STEM, but also in terms of education-wise, but also in terms of careers and entrepreneurship. So I'd say to balance the underrepresentation in STEM fields in APEC economies, there needs to be more of a concerted effort in the region to inspire, encourage, and support women and girls to engage and excel in STEM from an early age and throughout their lives. There should be appropriate support systems in place to be able to encourage more girls and young women to get into STEM. There's a lot I can go into here, but I'll keep it at that.
Well, I'm going to talk to Jill. You're an expert researcher in the education field. And just following up on what Carlos and Crystal have talked about, just this underrepresentation with STEM and young young women in this field. It makes it harder for financial inclusion as well. What do you think can be done?
Well, I definitely agree with Crystal that representation is important, but also I would appreciate efforts from the public or the private sector to offer scholarships, mentorship programs to encourage women and girls to participate in these sectors, that they can encourage young girls to eventually take up space as well. I know that APEC has an annual award called Aspire, which goes to a scientist who has published and collaborated with other scientists in the region, and I think that's one of the excellent ways to encourage women and girls to get into STEM.
And if I may just quickly point out that, APEC is doing a lot of work to help to promote STEM for women. So, there's initiatives such as the APEC Women in STEM Principles and Actions, the APEC Women in STEM Framework, the APEC Women in STEM Virtual Forum, and the APEC Women in STEM Award, among others. So,
And there's also the APEC App Challenge,
Yeah.
which you won a few years ago. So that was started by John Carr. So that's all really great programs and initiatives. So just opening it to the panel, how can we help people with untapped potential? Because this is about multi-stakeholders, that's why we're here today. With upskilling, future-proofing their jobs and skills in an increasingly digital economy. Does somebody want to take this?
I mean, it's, technology is very important. We can take advantage of it, but we need to keep in mind that technology also helps to automatize processes. So if people are not properly trained, they could lose jobs. So it's important to keep the pace in terms of training in order to have these benefits,
Yeah. In Singapore, I'm not sure if anyone knows, but I'm from Singapore, and the government actually pays anyone who wants to upskill in your career, or if you want to switch career, there is programs where they'll pay 90% of your course fees. So I think there's a lot of sharing between governments, information sharing on what best practices are, right? So I think that's also like in one way to upskill your population. Do you want to go, Michael?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out again in our survey, we found that digital transformation is seen as a driver for economic growth, for investment and innovation. 68% of those surveyed respondents say that digitalization positively impacts their economy. After all, this is about creating efficiencies. But only a minority view digital transformation negatively, citing concerns about security, false information, and manipulation, as well as concerns about job loss. About 7% say digitalization negatively impacts their economy.
I mean, that's super interesting because in light of what President Biden has very topical, timely executive order of creating a international standard for AI and for collaboration of international partners, said that I think digitization is generally a force for good, but some people can be left behind. It's a great point. Which brings us to our next segment of innovation. Again, there is a QR code, so if anybody wants to send questions for the panel, please feel free to do that. But on innovation and digitalization, the first executive order of AI of its kind from the US government requires the creation of new safety and security standards for AI, notably supporting workers, which is also really important because this is the year of labor, and working with international partners to implement those AI standards around the world. So can we talk about American leadership in this space and what cues leaders can take from this year's APEC Summit to come to an agreement that can help workers and consumers alike? Carlos, you want to start?
Well, for sure, the U.S. has been a leader in terms of innovation and digitalization. However, the U.S. is aware that to take proper advantage of it, we need to create proper standards. That's very important. That's the first step. And also, as I mentioned earlier, people need to keep up with technological progress. So training is very important. Otherwise, people will lose their jobs.
Yeah, upskilling is always the big question, right? How do we do it? Joe, as an education researcher, how do you think education of the future needs to evolve from the education of the past.
All right, so we learned a lot from the COVID-19 pandemic, right? When schools shut down across the world, children experienced significant learning losses. But even before that, we have countries that have been experiencing learning crisis. So I know that for the future, moving towards education in the future, we need to prioritize not only recovering the learning losses from COVID-19, but also on improving access to and quality of education in all the APEC economies. And how do you do that? Do we need AI or machine learning to achieve learning gains? There have been some studies on interventions that have been implemented to recover COVID-19 learning losses. I'm working on that. But also, so we found that mobile phone tutorials, EdTech, digital applications, and in-person tutoring have the most positive effects on student outcomes. But actually, the most low-tech interventions, using just mobile phones to connect teachers to their students, work the best. It produced learning gains equivalent to about 1.2 years of schooling for students. When you think about it, the intervention lasted maybe about 5 months. So that's amazing. So from this, you're gathering in San Francisco, the birthplace of AI,
tech capital.
Yeah.
Yep.
But it's time for the U.S. to maybe lead the other economies that may not be as high tech. But have mobile phones. Maybe they can support these economies in building the infrastructure to access remote and rural areas, get children phones so that they can achieve the learning.
I love what you said there. I mean, who would have thought that technology could create different and new kinds of inequality, right? So sometimes the low-tech solution is the perfect solution to upskill and to go towards tech. Great. So, Crystal, can you weigh on this? What ways, how to mitigate these problems of inequality caused by technology?
Yeah, so that's the reality that a lot of economies are having to deal with, is the inequality that technology is introducing. Although it's got many benefits to economies, it's also got challenges like that economies need to look into addressing. And in terms of technology inequality, I'll just give sort of a brief background about that. So essentially it refers to the unequal distribution of the benefits and costs of digital technology, such as access, skills, opportunities, and outcomes among different groups of people, such as by income, education, gender, race, geographic disability. Now this inadequate access to the latest technology can create more barriers for people who lack the necessary infrastructure, connectivity, and affordability to participate and benefit from the digital economy, especially those underserved and vulnerable groups such as women, youth, rural and remote communities, and people with disabilities.
Can I just get Carlos to jump in here?
Sure.
So, Carlos, what are some of the challenges of the digital economy and the developing countries?
Well, the challenges are not just, getting knowledge, getting the digital skills, but it's also about having access to infrastructure and equipment to participate in this digital economy. Let me give you one example during the pandemic in my home economy, Peru. So in Peru, because of the pandemic, schools had to switch to remote education. But during that process, around 100,000 students had to stop their education. They couldn't study anymore. Why?
That's a big number.
Because it was so sad. Many of them didn't have enough resources to have access to a smartphone, computer, a tablet. And so there was no way for them to follow the lessons. And sometimes the issues beyond skills, right? It's about affordability. And sometimes...
That's what Jill was talking about right there.
Correct. And we notice that to get a tablet or a computer is so expensive in some economies. And sometimes it's basically those very restrictive rules that are basically motivating a high price.
So why is it so expensive in Peru? Is it trade tariffs?
Tariffs, there have been some more tariffs, so tariffs have gone down, but I would say, in general, it could be higher taxes. It could be, for example, local content requirements in which producers are forced to use parts, components
Right.
from the same economy, and perhaps those parts and components are much more expensive. And so that all adds into the price.
Right.
Yeah. And also licenses, if customs procedures, paperwork is more bureaucratic,
Yep.
it takes more resources to firms as well.
It all adds up.
All adds up, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so I'll just quickly add to that. I mean, in Papua New Guinea, we're very, the access to technology is one very, very big barrier that a lot of our communities face, especially those out in the remote parts of the country. And so for a lot of kids, in terms of connectivity in general, you'd have to go to one part. In some provinces, you'd have to go to one part of the province to be able to get reception. So that's how difficult it is in terms of infrastructure to connect rural populations. So, I'm one of the lucky ones. I grew up in the city, so I had access to those sort of things. But outside of that, the reality on the ground is that many remote parts of economies across the region still face a lot of difficulty in terms of connectivity. So even getting to the software bit and trying to support remote work and remote education is a big challenge if the infrastructure isn't available.
Which is why it's so amazing of what you've done, being the head woman, STEM, and doing a great job.
Well, we have to lead the way, and everyone started from someplace. So but again, it gives us the opportunity to come to these sorts of events and to be a part of this sort of forum, to be able to talk to our own economies and demonstrate what can be done to help ensure that more women and more underserved communities are able to be reached.
Michael, how might APEC advance its work getting member economies to agree on building AI standards?
Yeah, I wanted to address that, and we'll have to see next week and in the coming years what the appetite is for member economies to look at standards, legislation, regulation, similar to the executive order that President Biden issued on AI earlier, was it last week? There's also legislation and regulation emerging from around the region on AI, and APEC's a great forum to discuss those best practices and figure out what works best for all of the economies at all levels of development.
So just like reflecting both what you and what Crystal just talked about. So maybe we should move on to our lightning round of your hopes of and two actionable items for APEC in the coming week. What are your hopes? What do you hope to see achieved or discussed in the next week with the leaders meeting and the CEOs meeting? Maybe Carlos, you go.
Okay, thanks so much, Pam. Well, I would expect some aspirational goals in terms of sustainability.
Yep.
For example, in the electricity sector, energy sector, to find ways to change the energy mix towards more renewables, or using processes that are more carbon neutral. Also, some goals in terms of phasing out the inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, and also reiterate some commitments to reduce emissions. At the same time, I think I would expect some goals to reduce the gap in participation rates between men and women, particularly in green sectors.
Wonderful. Crystal, would you like to?
Yeah, so in terms of two actionable items that I think are achievable goals of this year's APEC Summit are one, invest in human capital development, skills upgrading, and lifelong learning by providing accessible and affordable education and training programs that cater to diverse needs, interests, and aspiration of learners, especially the underserved and vulnerable groups, such as women, youth, rural and remote communities, and people with disabilities. This could include leveraging digital technologies such as e-learning, gamification, VR and artificial intelligence to enhance the quality and accessibility and affordability of education, as well as to promote the social and cultural inclusion and diversity of learners. And second would be to enhance the resiliency and sustainability of underserved communities by investing in green and sustainable infrastructure such as renewable energy, particularly solar energy, public transportation and waste management, as well as in social protection and safety nets such as healthcare, education, and income support that help to reduce the vulnerability and enhance the adaptive capacity of underserved communities. So overall, in general, I hope to see APEC members and stakeholders engage in productive and meaningful discussions and partnerships that result in some tangible and significant results and initiatives that could benefit communities across APEC.
Underserved, absolutely. Jill?
I totally share in your education hope. My fingers are crossed for that. But also I wanted to see, APEC economies they share a common denominator, the Pacific Ocean. I really hope to see some discussions on climate change. I know that, the World Risk Index ranks the Philippines as one of the most vulnerable economies actually to climate change, and like the other 20 countries 12 of them are APEC economies. This is the perfect avenue to discuss climate change, what can be done about it. The US and China are the biggest carbon contributors and we have the smaller economies, the Philippines, Indonesia.
Jakarta is sinking.
Yeah,
the capital.
They are also here in APEC, so I think it's a great avenue to discuss climate change.
Wonderful. And Michael?
And it's true. In fact, the wider public, some 7,000 people that we surveyed, indicate that the focus for APEC is on trade and digitalization, but they'd also like to see us focus on health and climate change. And so what I'd love to see coming out of Leaders Week is an initiative that takes action on climate change, and with the timing where we are, perhaps through an APEC caucus, bring those solutions to COP later in November and early December. And then my second hope is that APEC members come around initiating or identifying a platform, something like this, to listen to stakeholders and bring initiatives and ideas back into the forum so that our policy-making process can be a bit more holistic.
I just love that APEC leaders take time off their schedules every single year to come together, right? There's a lot of criticism about multilateral organizations. Does it still work? Is it still effective? But actually, because of the non-binding, more relaxed forum, people are actually coming together and having conversations which they would not have otherwise. That's mainly our panel. We've got a bunch of questions to get through in 13 minutes and more. Okay. Okay. Okay, let's go to the first question. There's a huge stack of them, but we'll try and get through them. The first question is, how is APEC promoting persons with disabilities to enter and thrive in the workplace? I'm not sure if this is an APEC question, or maybe Jill, as an educator, do you think what are the gaps for people with disabilities to enter and thrive the workplace? Have you thought about?
Maybe Carlos have more.
Well, I mean, it's important, to be in an inclusive society. So, we lose a lot of, human resources if we are not tapping into, all segments of society. So that's very, very, very important for us. And I think what we need to do a lot also is to raise awareness about the need of accessibility.
Yeah.
So, for example, we notice that many buildings nowadays are having different standards in comparison to 10, 20 years ago.
The plan,
Now, the new buildings, of course, when, let's say, we need to use the restroom, the doors are much wider, and that's inclusive. Otherwise,
and at a height that people can reach.
Exactly. And then have ramps, no steps, or elevators. And so that's something that we need to start gradually doing.
Just sharing international standards as practices.
Correct.
Yeah.
There's a different, I think, level of acceptance and how we treat people with disabilities across all APEC member economies. I think there have been some efforts in APEC to stand up some policy fora to look at addressing some of those needs, but really I think it needs to be addressed across all the policy fora.
Wonderful. Next question, and this is a tech question, so maybe Crystal, you can take this one. Are big tech companies too big for member economies of APEC to influence, or are they taking the lead in closing the digital divide?
So, great question. Well, they're big in the sense that they've been able to grow themselves to that stage. But again, economies economies are able to work with these big tech giants and technology companies to look at how they can work with them to help bridge the digital divide. But there are a lot of, in terms of the big tech companies, there's a lot of work that they've been doing to ensure that, as part of their social inclusion programs, to ensure that more underserved communities are reached. So there's a lot of like the APEC Women in Economy Forum that I attended in Seattle in August. We had Microsoft's head of digital social inclusion there, and so she talked about some of their programs that are there to help serve underserved communities. So there are courses, certifications that tech giants like Google, Microsoft, etc. are providing, and the cost of education these days is also greatly reduced. So the barriers to being able to access different certification programs to upskill oneself is now more than available today than it was before. So the advice I always give young people is, the internet's there. If you've got access to it, make use of it. I spent my time on YouTube pretty much learning to code and stuff like that. So, and it's great to see that, tech giants are providing support programs and certifications. So, if you're able to get a certification as a Meta front-end developer or Google, user experience designer, then, that's one way in which one pathway into tech that you can get into. So
in a way, they're helping.
They're helping, but I think, this forum gives the opportunity. We've got the APEC CEO Summit coming up, so you get to see a lot of the tech CEOs going there. So there's room for more dialogue and more partnerships between tech giants and economies to look at how they can support education and career development.
Or have more public-private partnerships.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's always needed.
Something that Jill loves to talk about. Yeah. Do you want to take that or no?
Oh no, I totally concur with.
Okay, speaking of, do you want to
I'll
go?
jump in, Pam.
Oh, yeah.
Speaking of partnerships, we have had partnerships with Google and the Asia Foundation to run the APEC App Challenge that you mentioned earlier, and Crystal's a winner. We use this app challenge as a way to address the policy priorities of each APEC year through finding tech solutions. And I think one potential avenue might be to look at spreading this app challenge more widely across fora, to look at how we can embrace technology to bypass some of our preconceptions and get to where we need to be a little bit faster.
Just a minute on this. From the APEC App Challenge, the Digital Makers Asia Pacific group was established out of that, and so the past alumni members from the APEC App Challenge, really the vision behind that is to work with tech companies like Google and the Asia Foundation outside of tech to look at how innovators and entrepreneurs, designers, developers, and engineers like us can be the bridge between policymakers and communities on the ground. Because oftentimes we've got all these wonderful discussions happening, and the policies are aligned, but we don't see that much trickling down to our community. So really, that's been one great initiative that's come out of the APEC App Challenge, is to have this group in place where we're able to have conversations with Dr. Rebecca really directly to look at how we can help to align a lot of the priorities here.
So fascinating. We can talk a lot more on how your path has spun forward from the app challenge and how that's really essential in helping MSMEs, get their products online and get them on apps so people can access them more widely. But I think we need to move on to the other questions. This one's for Carlos. Carlos, rising ESG regulations by countries intended for businesses in the jurisdictions are on the rise. What do you think are needed to be considered by regulators for these policies to not become protectionist measures, which could endanger the supply chain resilience and trade openness? Very good question. Very typical.
Well, I think ESG regulations are very important. They are here to stay, but we need to ensure that they are not going to create some problems in a way that they could be used as a source of protectionism. And in that way, I think we need to go for a sort of a blueprint to advance good regulatory practices in a way that we could feature tools, regulatory processes, and enough flexibility that could help us to support innovation, support growth, keep sustainability standards, having appropriate governance, among other things.
Great. We have a couple of questions from indigenous, the indigenous multi-stakeholder, which I think we should try and address. This one's open to anyone who wants to do it. What efforts have been made to consider integrating indigenous voices or traditional knowledge in APEC? APEC's approach to engagement. Maybe this is more of a Michael question, especially in terms of climate change or digital innovation.
I'm going to jump in and ask Carlos to help me out. We have really, I think, put more emphasis on work with indigenous peoples since the APEC Putrajaya Vision 2040 has been put into place, and in particular, the Aotearoa Plan of Action. And so when we're meeting throughout the year, quarterly, at our senior officials meetings and the policy forum meetings, we've integrated voices from stakeholders and indigenous peoples in particular. I recall there were some workshops at the Economic Committee recently in Seattle.
I know Ambassador Catherine Tai is also hosting an indigenous-specific event tonight or tomorrow, I think. And I think U.S. leaders and global leaders are also getting more engaged. And that's the first time she's doing something like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, and actually, in terms of, now that we talk about Ambassador trade, because one of the areas in trade is intellectual property. And in APEC, we have the intellectual property expert groups. And one of the topics in the agenda that we discuss is about protection of traditional knowledge. So that's very important.
Oh, interesting. Another indigenous question: how do indigenous entrepreneurs best access the variety of resources, funding, and support from APEC? That's quite specific. Maybe Crystal, you're not indigenous, but maybe for indigenous populations, communities from Papua New Guinea, are there any resources that they can reach out to?
There's, I talked about how, like being in the city and being in the urban centers gives you an advantage. So with a lot of these communities being underserved and underrepresented and being in the outlying areas of different economies in the region, access to a lot of the needed services and resources to help them establish businesses and access much needed resources to create innovation and promote growth is very limited. And so there's definitely
space for more
improvement in this area.
And this week coming up.
Yeah, exactly. This week coming up. So hopefully there'll be one important priority that they just can discuss.
Yeah.
I think it's important to think about APEC as really setting the infrastructure for MSMEs and businesses to access those resources. And so through APEC, a business might work with their government officials, their representatives in their departments of foreign affairs or trade or other areas to get their voices heard through the process.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. We have 1 more minute. How will geopolitical tensions between the U.S. and China impede progress in meeting APEC's goal with regard to sustainable development? That's a hot button question. Maybe we should skip that one. Yeah.
How can I mention something? Sometimes, I mean, we see that we hear some political rhetoric, but I think it's in the best interest to have a win-win situation.
Yeah.
But in reality, what we can see is that we have a very strong relationship between U.S. and China. Actually, if we look at the trade statistics, the bilateral trade between U.S. and China is at the highest historical level ever.
Right. Despite what the headlines say. Go for it.
And despite what the headlines will tell you, within the APEC meeting room, the US and China and every other member economy are speaking with each other. So it's actually a forum to share information and to talk and to engage versus this perception of disengagement that we're hearing about.
Wonderful. And with that, I think we should wrap our panel. Thank you very much. We're at time.